Hi friends, it's Lacey from Pandemonium Publishing House, and it is Live with Lacey on this Friday, and I am answering your questions like I try to do every single week. So you can send us in your questions at pandapublishing8@gmail.com, or you can leave your questions in the comments below. So today we've got 4 questions that came in during this week, and I thought that they were really interesting. So we'll start with those, and then if you have any questions while we're sitting here chatting, make sure you put them in the comments below. Okay, so the first one is, how important is word count? Do you reject books for being too long or too short? This is a really good question. So I've never rejected a book for either being too long or too short, but there are industry standards, and let's talk about that. So with every genre, there's a specific word count that you need to follow that, makes your book competitive in the marketplace. So different genres have different word counts attached to them. So let's use children's books, for example. The sweet spot with those are around 850, 900 words, sometimes 950, depending on the subject matter. But anything 1,000 words and over is something that we maybe want to trim, okay? So in terms of rejecting a book based on word count, I look at it this way. We can always add and we can always take away. It's easier to take away words in a manuscript than it is to sometimes add them. So if we're talking about science fiction, for example, and you've got a manuscript that's way over the count, okay, it's easier to usually trim that back than it is to add. And the reason being is because usually the story is fully developed. So we're able to trim in places where maybe there's too much exposition, or maybe there are repetitive words or scenes that we can cut that aren't going to take away from the premise of the book. They're not going to cut out important plot points, things like that. So I've never rejected a book for being too long or too short, but that being said, it does have to meet the industry standard. So we're always willing to kind of work with you and say, this is what the standard is for the industry. This is what we need to see. We need to either trim or we need to either add. And authors are really good about doing that. So never had a problem with it. Great question. Thank you for sending that in. And we'll go to the next one. So is it harder to sell books with an unlikable main character? That's a really good question. There have been a few books that have had some unlikable characters in them. Now we're talking about a main character. I don't think I've ever come across that yet, but maybe I will. That being said, I think it's important to have a level of relatability with your characters. So you have to make your reader feel something when you're creating characters in any scope, whether it's the main character protagonist, whether it's the antagonist, whether it's, supporting characters. They have to connect with your audience, and you have to be relatable, okay? So even if there's like a little glimmer of something that allows me to connect with someone I don't necessarily like, you can definitely hang in there and continue with the story. Now, that being said, I remember being a kid and my mom saying to me, I forget what movie it was, or we were watching a TV series or something, and I was like, I hate that character. Like, I just can't deal with him. I don't like him. And I remember having really, really strong feelings around it. And my mom saying to me, well, that means they're a darn good actor because of the fact that they made you hate them. Okay? So that's in essence what I'm saying is, even if you don't like the character, even if you feel hatred towards them, you're doing your job, okay, as an author, and making your readers feel something. So I don't think it's harder to sell books with an unlikable main character. I think it'd be an interesting way to market them, actually, and it would be a challenge, that's for sure. So I don't think it would be harder to sell books like that, but it would be a different way that you could potentially market them. And we have perhaps a book coming out that I had just done some developmental edits on, and I said to the author, you know what, I really don't like this supporting character. Like, there are no redeeming qualities. I cannot get behind her. You need to make her relatable in some way, in any way possible, the tiniest way. But like, for me right now, get rid of her unless we make her human, right? There's people all over the place that you may not get along with or agree with, and you know, you can still relate to them in some way. So that's what we have to remember when we're writing. We're creating these real characters for our readers to either connect with, or to aspire to, or to engage with, or to empathize with. So just make sure that you're creating that connection and allowing your readers to kind of sit beside those characters and say, I wonder what I would do if I was in their position. Okay, so that's a good question. So no, I don't think it's harder to sell books with unlikable main characters. I just think it's a different marketing challenge. So, what's the biggest mistake authors make when writing for kids? This is a good question. They preach to their audience, and that is something that I discourage. Okay? Our job as authors is to educate, to entertain, to help people escape, to show different perspectives, to create feelings that we just talked about among our readers, and connection to those characters and events, and have a relatability kind of connection with our audience. So the biggest mistake that authors make when writing for kids is they preach to them. They think that every children's book has to have a moral lesson, you know, that there's got to be a moral attached to it. And I always say, you know what, it's not our job to raise other people's kids. It is our job to tell the story to the best of our ability that's going to connect with kids out there. Their parents' job is to teach them, you know, their values and their morals and all of those things. Not saying that we're creating books for kids that are just entertainment and empty, right? There's always something there that can be a subtle type of lesson, okay? So, for example, Panda the Very Bad Cat, we'll use that as the flagship book. You know, the book was chaotic, and I could recite it to you right now because I have done that 7 billion times over the course of 10 years, but I won't. So it's a book about chaos, and this cat, Panda the cat, was a very bad boy. He loved to find mischief more than a toy. Okay, so there's a little excerpt of it for you. But this whole book is about this cat destroying this family's house, right? He gets into everything, and his little owner is like trying to keep him from knocking over the bookshelf and running through paint on the counter and knocking over eggs and bacon and all this kind of stuff. So the whole thing is that, you know what, there may not be an obvious lesson there, but there is under the surface. It's very, very, very subtle. Is that, you know what, we love people just the way that they are, and we're willing to help others in order to let them understand that maybe what they're doing isn't so helpful. So that being said, there's an underlying message there which is not in your face. And I mean, I think that that's the point of writing for kids, is to let them come to the conclusion of, what do you think the lesson is here? What do you think the author was trying to say? Why was Panda a bad cat? What could he do to maybe behave a little bit better? But that being said, what do you love about him? Do you love his out-of-the-box creativity? Do you think that he was genuinely trying to bring excitement to this house? Or maybe he was genuinely trying to help? What are the lessons here? And what are the things that you can take from this? The other thing is, too, is that no matter what, you're loved. You're surrounded by love. Not saying you could go, you know, be a destructive cyclone, right? But chances are, even if you do have your bad days where you're just completely chaotic, that people are still going to love you. So I want the message for kids book authors to be, it's not our job to preach to kids. It's our job to subtly put in those ideas where they can discuss them with their parents and guardians and caregivers and say, you know what, what do you think about this? And when people come to the conclusion on their own, that's when it's more valuable, and it's when it's more ingrained, and when they're more likely to understand the core messaging and, the reasons of behind it, but also how they can implement those things into their life. So, little kids ages 4 to 7 are who children's books are for usually. And those kids are learning about responsibility and cleaning up and, doing the things that they need to do and completing their chores and all that kind of stuff. And maybe through Panda the Very Bad Cat, they see that when they don't do that, it's very hard for the people around them to keep taking on that extra responsibility that they have. So I hope that new authors and established authors will understand, especially for kids' books writing, that we're not there to preach to kids. We're there to educate and entertain and allow them to get to those messages very subtly under the surface on their own, and have discussions about the characters and the goings on and the plot and what's happening and why it's happening and why are they behaving like this in the book, that sort of thing. So that was a really good question. What's the one thing authors should stop worrying about in their writing career? Okay, this is a good question too. I would say there are a bunch of things actually. So writing for trends, we never ever ever want to write for trends, okay? So by the time you get to writing for a trend, let's use like, vampires, for example. Remember Twilight and how there were so many vampire stories and like people were submitting books about vampires and like the plot lines were very similar, okay, to the Twilight series. By the time you start writing for a trend, it's usually over or on its way out, okay? So I know this sounds cliche, but you want to write the book that you want to see on the shelf. Write for you, first of all, okay? Obviously, you want to be in tune with what your audience wants, what they're looking for, what they enjoy reading, different genres and what those expectations are. But the thing that I think authors should stop worrying about, one of them, this is the one we'll start with, is trying to write for trends and trying to say, okay, what's the next up and coming thing, right? If trends are so fickle, and that's the problem, that by the time you start writing for them, like I said, they're already over or they're on their way out, and you want to be true to yourself. That's another thing that I'm going to talk about, like that kind of bleeds into that, is being authentic. So don't try and be who you think people expect you to be as an author. Don't try to fit into a box creatively. Don't try to be anybody but yourself, because authenticity is key. Your readers want to know who you are, why you're writing, why you decided to write your story, the inspiration behind that. And I know I've said that a million times, but it's so true. And people can see through, fakeness immediately. So that is something that you definitely don't want to do. You want to be who you are as a writer. You want to maintain your voice. And I always say this, you can't write a book or create a piece of art without leaving pieces of yourself on the page or the canvas, because writing is such a cathartic process, but it's also it's difficult in some areas, especially when we're writing about things that aren't necessarily joyous or easy to talk about. So that being said, writing is one of those things that allows you to create whatever you want, and there has to be an authenticity there. That's why I don't think AI is going to take over anything, okay? There's no heart and soul, there's no spirit, there's no heartbeat behind it, okay? And that's what makes you a writer. So that's another thing that I don't think authors should worry about, is trying to fit into everybody's box, trying to be a similar author as to people in their genre. Like, I don't know, Janet Ivanovich, she writes a great series, a Stephanie Plum series, and she's been one of my favorite authors to read because her books are just so fun to escape into. And, I got to meet her in person actually at a book signing that she was having in Toronto, and I got up there with my book and I got her to sign it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to be just like you. This was in my younger years, and when I was first an author, and she looked at me and she said something I'll never forget. She said, don't be like me, be like you. So I took that advice and I wrote the way that I wanted to. You know, I read a lot of books. So that's another thing that you want to remember too. You're going to naturally pick up your voice, okay? You're going to pick up the way that you say things and those inflections and those ideas and the way that you see the world. And the more you read, the more you're going to get a handle on, you know, how you speak and how you give voices to your characters and how you see the world and the perspective that you come from. So find your own voice by reading a ton of books. Read as much as you can. Read outside of your genre, all of that good stuff, because that's going to help you develop your own writing voice. And you know what? We take bits and pieces from people that we don't even realize. Like, how many times do you interact with people that you work with and you find yourself saying something that they say and you're like, oh, I can't believe I just said that. That's usually what she says. So, you know, everybody kind of has an impact on us when we are intertwined or ingrained or exposed to even. So I think it's important to find your voice, and to do that you want to look at all these different options that you have in terms of reading and writing and, you know, doing workshops and classes and finding out who you are as an author. So I don't want you to try to be like anybody else, and I want you to be authentic, and I want you to not preach to kids okay, through your children's books. Another thing I wish authors would stop worrying about is perfection, okay? I forget who said this, and I've quoted this before, but art is never completed, it is only abandoned. So we know that no matter what, by the time you're done your book and it's published and it's out there, that there will always be something that you look at and you think that you could say better. So that being said, don't worry about perfection. Have a polished manuscript when you want to submit it to publishers, but don't worry about being perfect. We don't expect you to be perfect, so just make sure you give it your best shot, put your best foot forward, and give us the most polished version, because that's what we're expecting. So thanks so much for joining me on Live with Lacey, and it's a pleasure to talk to you every week and answer the questions that you send in to pandapublishing8@gmail.com, and I will try and get to them all. Have a really great weekend, everybody.